During the Second World War, aircraft and equipment were manufactured in unprecedented numbers, shortcomings were addressed, and new designs were initiated. The wings of victory emerged from designs that existed at the war's beginning, but others, with much greater capability, were approaching combat as the war concluded. Areas that had been largely overlooked during the interwar years were hastily, but intelligently, pursued, particularly anti-submarine warfare. Newer technologies such as radar, jet propulsion, guided missiles, rockets and helicopters were explored. Of these, radar was crucial. If the war had continued, other new fields would have increased in importance. American aircraft production increased from 5,856 in 1939 to 26,277 in 1941 and peaked at 96,318 in 1944. Naval aircraft acceptances were 1939, 303, 1940, 4,229, and 1944, 29,515. 1941 and 1944 figures include aircraft manufactured for the United States in Canada. In 1938, French and British orders and funding started the industry's expansion. After the fall of France in May 1940, President Roosevelt called for the United States to produce 50,000 planes a year. After the Pearl Harbor attack, he increased this to 60,000 planes for 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. These latter numbers were never met but served as goals and incentives. Production required decisions on types, numbers, designs, and delivery schedules of aircraft for the Army, Navy, and America's allies. The Joint Army-Navy-British Purchasing Commission came into being for that purpose in mid-1940. It became the Joint Aircraft Committee in April 1941, and finally the Aircraft Production Board. Subordinate elements included the Aircraft Resources Control Office and Aircraft Scheduling Unit. These organizations defined Army, Navy, and British needs for American aviation material, and thus permitted orderly production plans and material and manpower allocations. In mid-1941, production cognizance was divided between the Army and Navy. Industrial expansion took many forms. Companies enlarged plants, usually with federal funds, expanded into leased space, and subcontracted. Plants were erected in areas that tapped new labor sources, and companies whose normal business was suspended for the duration became airplane builders. For example, Grumman's floor space at Bethpage, New York, was increased 25 times. It also leased available nearby space. Despite that, subcontracting accounted for 27% of total output. Even more Grumman airplanes were needed. The General Motors Corporation, through its Eastern Aircraft Division, converted East Coast automobile assembly plants to airplane factories and built Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. Eastern built about 3 times as many of these aircraft as Grumman. New plants were erected at Columbus, Ohio to manufacture Curtiss Navy aircraft and at Jonesville, Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia for Brewster. Engine production was similarly decentralized. Pratt & Whitney engines were manufactured by 5 different automobile and small airplane engine companies. A Pratt & Whitney subsidiary operated a new plant at Kansas City, Missouri. Production seemed to be an end in itself, as the phrase production pipeline indicated. Changes, whether for military utility or safety of flight, could not be made if they slowed deliveries. Thus, many new airplanes required modification before delivery to combat units. This was particularly true of the multi-engine Army bombers that were converted to patrol planes. Air stations and other units were involved in such endeavors. Finally, as aircraft builders became adept at production management, they learned to introduce blocks of changes without delaying deliveries. Prior to the war, only a single airplane was available to flight test a given configuration. If it crashed, testing and subsequent procurement were either delayed until a replacement could be built, or, frequently, procurement was initiated without complete testing. This approach was not necessary during the war. With airplanes streaming out of factories, many were available for flight testing modifications and design changes. As many as 100 fighters, and a comparable number of other types, were used at a time in various development and test projects. In July 1941, A Navy Coordinator of Research and Development was established to improve intra-Navy research and development and to work with such agencies as the National Defense Research Council. Dr. J.C. Hunsaker, who had headed the Navy Bureau of Construction and Repairs Aircraft Division during the First World War, and had directed the Bureau of Aeronautics Aircraft Development until the mid-1920s, was first coordinator. He then became director of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. As the Navy Department staff grew rapidly, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was displaced from its space next to Bureau of Aeronautics and moved about a mile away. Thus, the casual day-to-day contact of Bureau of Aeronautics National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Interwar Relations was lost. Key employees, however, retained a residual understanding that contributed to solving the scientific and technical problems. Research and development field activities grew apace. Flight testing, having outgrown Naval Air Station Anacostia, District of Columbia, relocated in 1943 to the newly established Naval Air Station Patuxent River, Maryland. The Naval Air Test Center was established there in 1945. Naval aircraft factory work became so diverse that in 1943 an overall command, the Naval Air Material Center, was established with subordinate units. The Naval Aircraft Modification Unit, the Naval Auxiliary Air Station, and the Naval Air Engineering Station, as well as Naval Aircraft Factory. Within Naval Air Engineering Station were the Aeronautical Engine Laboratory, Aeronautical Radio and Radar Laboratory, and the Aeronautical Photographic Experimental Laboratory. A ship's installation division, which developed catapults and arresting gear, was reassigned from Naval Air Engineering Station to Naval Aircraft Factory. After the Brewster Factory at Jonesville was closed in 1944, Naval Aircraft Modification Unit relocated there. Its primary role became the development of guided missiles. It was the forerunner of the Naval Air Development Center, Warminster, Pennsylvania. In November 1943, Naval Ordnance Test Station, Inyokern, California, was established to develop and test rockets and other weapons. Experimental and developmental work were widespread. Special projects dealing with various aspects of airborne radar included Project Roger, set up at Naval Aircraft Factory in May 1941 to test airborne radar. Project Affirm, originally Argus, set up in April 1942 at Naval Air Station Quonset Point, Rhode Island, to develop and test night fighter equipment and tactics, and Project Cast, begun in April 1943 at Naval Air Station Squantum, Massachusetts, to test radio and electronic equipment developed by National Defense Research Council's Radiation and Radio Research Laboratories. Guided missile development involved Naval Aircraft Factory and naval air stations at Cape May, New Jersey, Traverse City, Michigan, and Clinton, Oklahoma. On January 1, 1943, the Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet, was established. Readying new airplanes, ships, and newly trained men, Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet welded the air elements into combat-worthy units. In addition to training air groups and overseeing carrier shakedown cruises, Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet tied together loose ends of airplanes and equipment. Through control of air stations, it was in the midst of the various aircraft modification programs. The Navy's overall lack of anti-submarine warfare experience gave Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet, an even more active role in that field. To help, the Air Anti-Submarine Development Detachment, Atlantic Fleet, was established at Naval Air Station Quonset Point on April 1, 1943. In September, its mission was broadened as it became the Anti-Submarine Development Detachment. Bureau of Aeronautics was responsible for the various aviation material programs. Its engineering elements became a division that handled research, development, design, and evaluation. Airplanes, engines, structures, instruments, catapults, arresting gear, and so forth. Guns, bombs, torpedoes, and rockets were developed by the Bureau of Ordnance. Radio and radar responsibilities were shared with the Bureau of Ships. The Naval Research Laboratory and National Defense Research Council's Radiation Laboratory shared actual development with the radio and electrical industries. The Chief of Bureau of Aeronautics reported to the Secretary of the Navy but advised the Chief of Naval Operations on aviation matters. This proved adequate during the first year and a half of the war, when production was the major problem. As war materials became available in quantity, the logistical problems of meeting fleet needs began to dominate. Logistical planning was a chief of naval operations function. Thus, in August 1943, a deputy chief of naval operations, Air, was established and 5 Bureau of Aeronautics divisions were transferred to it. Thus, before the United States entered the war, the British found radar-equipped night fighters to be necessary. In the Pacific, exhausted troops on Guadalcanal had their sleep disrupted by night hecklers. Aviation forces had little success countering them with improvised night fighting schemes and shore-based fighter direction. In late 1943, carrier pilots attempted to fend off night intruders with Hellcats flying wing on an Avenger equipped with search radar. Anticipating such needs, Bureau of Aeronautics in September 1941 had asked National Defense Research Council to develop radar for single-seat fighters. In April 1942, a night fighter development project, originally Project Argus, later a firm was established at Naval Aircraft Factory Quonset Point. In the meantime, the Marine Corps, following recommendations of observers who had studied British equipment and techniques, requested a twin-engine aircraft with aircraft intercept radar. The 1st Marine Night Fighter Squadron, activated on November 16, 1942, eventually obtained a few twin-engine aircraft and fitted them with the obsolete British aircraft intercept radar. Project Affirm continued the single-place night fighter concept, and, in late 1942, Naval Aircraft Factory began modifying Corsairs by fitting them with aircraft intercept radar from National Defense Research Council. On April 1, 1943, Navy Squadron 75 was established and Marine Night Fighter Group 53 was activated. Navy and Marine units deployed into the Solomons on October 31, and a pilot from Squadron 75, aided by the Marine Squadron's ground-based fighter director, made a successful night interception. An improved aircraft intercept radar was used in the night fighter Hellcat. Later, red lighting instrument panels and a redesigned windshield improved the pilot's night vision, thus increasing effectiveness of the night fighter Corsair and Hellcat variants. The above 3 models were used aboard carriers. The usual method of increasing fighter performance was to increase engine power. This was true with the machines discussed above and with other developmental fighters. The Grumman Tigercat increased power by using 2 rather than 1 engine. It was begun in 1940, won and approved for production in 1943. A 2-seat version with provisions for aircraft intercept radar was built to meet Marine Corps night fighter requirements. The Grumman Bearcat, begun in 1943, used the improved engine, also used in the later Corsair, in a machine somewhat smaller than the Wildcat. The goal was an interceptor to operate from both fast and escort carriers. Severe weight-saving features were employed, including a reduced safety factor and safety wing tips that would break away at ultimate load, leaving it with reduced span and higher landing speed but still intact and flyable. Both the Tigercat and the Bearcat were nearing combat introduction in August 1945. Other new fighters used larger engines. Goodyear modified the Corsair design using the largest available engine. After the close of the war, they became surplus, and some were acquired and used by racing pilots. The Vought experimental design had an almost circular wing and outboard propellers. It promised a top speed of almost 500 miles per hour and vertical takeoff. An initial contract for the flying scale model was issued in February 1940, months before a Navy fighter achieved 400 miles per hour. The military version was undertaken during the war. Maintaining balanced airflow required that the dual engines and propellers be interconnected. If that was not complicated enough, articulating propellers were also found to be necessary. The experimental aircraft was finally reported to be completed in 1948, but by then it had no military mission. To many Bureau of Aeronautics engineers, its complex power transmission and control system seemed an Achilles heel. Therefore, it was scrapped without having ever flown. Meanwhile, jet engines had shown how to achieve 500 miles per hour and much more. Bureau of Aeronautics began studying jet fighters in 1942. 2 small companies, McDonnell and Ryan, received the first jet contracts, McDonnell in January 1943 for the twin-jet experimental design, and Ryan in March for the composite experimental model. The McDonnell design used 2 Westinghouse jet engines and was to determine requirements for carrier-based jet fighters. The Ryan design, powered by a conventional engine with a General Electric jet in the tail for takeoff and high-speed flight, was to be used on escort carriers. For fast carrier use, Bureau of Aeronautics contracted with Curtiss for an experimental design powered by a conventional engine and an Alice Chalmers production model of the British jet. A production contract was issued for 100 aircraft, over two-thirds of them were delivered, and one squadron was outfitted. As other engine combinations became interesting, Ryan received contracts for other composite fighters. All composite fighter programs were terminated in 1947. The McDonnell Phantom first flew on January 21, 1945, and 19 months later a Phantom became the first jet to operate from an American carrier, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The production model was redesignated. In 1944, based in part on the promise of earlier designs and in part on the maturing of the wartime aviation industry, Bureau of Aeronautics held its first wartime design competition for a new fighter. 3 new designs were selected for development: the Vought, the North American, and the McDonnell designs. With these 3 designs and the Phantom, the Navy entered the jet age. In December 1941, the fleet was equipped with the obsolete Devastator torpedo bomber and its contemporary but modernized Dauntless dive bomber. In mid-1942, the Grumman Avenger, also built by Easton, replaced the Devastator. The Dauntless fought from carriers for another 2 years. A more powerful engine, radar, improved armament, and so forth kept it combat-worthy. It typifies the endeavor described by S. Paul Johnston, a leading aeronautical research administrator. Everything learned from wind tunnel and structural test laboratories was incorporated in the production models in an effort to outfly and outfight the opposition. At the time that the aviation industry was expanding, the Bureau of Aeronautics was increasing the number and complexity of new aircraft designs. Inevitably, there were growing pains. Thus, the 3 most advanced developmental dive bombers, the Curtiss Helldiver, Brewster design, and Douglas variant, and the leading torpedo bomber, the Grumman Avenger, all became so seriously overweight that their usefulness was questioned. As a fallback for the Avenger, Bureau of Aeronautics chose the competitively designed Vought alternative. Since Vought was already committed to the Corsair and another design, Bureau of Aeronautics persuaded Vultee to manufacture the alternative design in a truck plant in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Engineers were recruited throughout the industry, and the aircraft was redesigned. This aircraft never saw combat. When production began in 1944, the Avenger was meeting Navy needs. The Helldiver went into combat after long travail. Production was achieved in late 1942, but 2 carriers turned it down, favoring the Dauntless. The Helldiver underwent 3 modification programs, then a squadron on Bunker Hill used it in the second Rabaul strike in November 1943. They gave it approval. The worst was over. The Helldiver replaced the Dauntless aboard ship in time for most of the 1944 offensives. The other 2 dive bomber designs, by this time converted to single-seat configurations, were both terminated. With Bureau of Aeronautics guidance, Douglas then designed a new experimental torpedo bomber. To save weight, the bomb bay was omitted, an explosive bomb ejector replaced the displacing gear, and the structure was designed under strength and reinforced after structural tests. Grumman, after working on a couple of twin-engine torpedo planes, eventually proposed a design based on the Avenger but larger and cleaner, and with a jet propulsion unit in the tail. It was developed as an experimental design. Martin, having completed production of an Army attack plane, undertook another design. These 3 designs were continued post-war. Tactical and technical considerations were both involved in combining the dive bomber and torpedo bomber into a general-purpose attack plane. By the end of 1941, British and Japanese combat experience was leading to the conclusion that all offensive carrier planes should be capable of torpedo attack. The Battle of Midway, where our torpedo squadrons made no hits and only 6 of 41 planes survived, suggested otherwise. For the next 2 years, airborne torpedoes were weapons of opportunity. During that time, the Bureau of Ordnance and the National Defense Research Council corrected the aircraft torpedo's many defects and improved it for use at moderate altitude and speed. Our airborne torpedoes acquired the effectiveness ascribed to them by pre-war advocates. Several other factors were also important. Midway and other early operations also demonstrated that high-altitude bombing, the secondary mission of torpedo planes, was ineffective against ships. Military characteristics of aircraft and equipment involved consideration of technical feasibility and military needs. Hence, they required a meeting of minds of engineers and planners in Bureau of Aeronautics and Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Air. Second World War aircraft were short-lived, with a 7 to 13-year service life, compared to modern machines that have service lives of 20 to 30 years. Advancing technology and military necessity caused designs to become obsolete. For example, the top speed of the Wildcat was about 330 miles per hour, the Hellcat 380 miles per hour, and the various Corsairs 415 to 445 miles per hour. The foregoing surveys major areas involved in equipping the Navy with aircraft and material. We will now examine in more detail some particular areas: selected aircraft types, anti-submarine warfare, radar, guided missiles, and power plants. 4 designs were used during the war: the Brewster Buffalo, Grumman Wildcat, Vought Corsair, and the Grumman Hellcat. The first 2 were in service in December 1941. Buffalo production ended in April 1942, and it was phased out of service after the Battle of Midway in June. In December 1941, the fixed-wing Wildcat version was operational, and the folding-wing variant, the first Grumman aircraft with folding wings, was entering production. The Japanese Zero surpassed the Wildcat in speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. Despite that, the analysts that wrote the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet report of the Battle of Midway said that 3 Zeros were shot down for each Wildcat. Having that to allow for over-optimistic claims still leaves the Wildcat with an appreciable edge. As the analysts noted, however much of this superiority may exist in our splendid pilots, part at least rests in the armor, armament, and leak-proof tanks of our planes. By implication, this included the ruggedness that let the Wildcat continue flying after heavy battle damage. The Wildcat was the Navy's main fighter for another year. In February 1943, the Corsair began combat from shore bases, and on August 31st, the Hellcat entered combat from fast carriers. Grumman installed a 1,350 horsepower engine in a new Wildcat, the experimental version. Earlier Wildcats had 1,200 horsepower. Produced by Eastern as the improved model, this airplane operated from escort carriers in both the Atlantic and the Pacific for the duration. The Hellcat was begun in June 1940 when Bureau of Aeronautics requested the engine in the Wildcat be replaced with a more powerful variant. Grumman made a completely new design. The experimental model, with a 1,700 horsepower engine, made its first flight in June 1942, and the second experimental version, with a 2,000 horsepower engine, flew in July. The Navy recovered its first repairable Japanese Zero from the Aleutians in June. The near conjunction of dates disproves the oft-repeated myth that the Hellcat was based on a captured Zero. The Hellcat and Corsair, begun in 1939, were the first-line fighters during the 1943 through 1945 offensives. They were powered by 2,000 horsepower engines. The later Corsair used a 2,100 horsepower engine. Later, Corsairs and Hellcats had water injection engines, as did the improved Wildcat, permitting 10 minutes of increased power. Some were equipped with search radar, and others with night intercept radar. Many changes were made to increase combat effectiveness of the Corsair over the experimental version. To mention one, a self-sealing fuel tank in the fuselage replaced integral wing tanks. This required moving the cockpit aft, and caused loss of vision that made the Corsair unsatisfactory for carrier operations. A raised cockpit and longer tail wheel did much to overcome the problem. In January 1945, the Corsair began regular sustained operations from carriers. After the dive bomber became a naval aircraft type in the mid-1930s, fighters were designed primarily as gun platforms. However, the strength and power that characterized the Corsair and Hellcat enabled them to be readily modified to fighter bombers. Each could carry forward-firing rockets, 2 1,000-pound bombs, or a droppable fuel tank. The proportion of fighters assigned to fast carriers increased steadily from 25% of complement in 1942 to 50% in 1944 and to 70% in 1945. The dual role made this great increase in air-to-air combat power possible, with little loss in carrier air-to-surface capability. When the Germans' daytime bombing losses over England in 1940 became unacceptable, they switched to night bombing. Torpedo planes, not being stressed for dive bombing, came to be used for glide and toss bombing. The Helldiver was capable of torpedo attack. Fighter escorts were found to be necessary, even though the Helldiver and Avenger were equipped with flexible guns, some of them in power turrets. Hence, the guns and gunners were eventually recognized as superfluous. Airborne radar had altered the role of carrier scouts, and by mid-1945 airborne early warning was promising even greater changes. These reasons all contributed to the decision to replace dive bombers and torpedo planes with general-purpose attack planes. The process is very complex, and a dozen experimental designs were initiated between 1939 and 1945 to arrive at the combination of missions. In December 1941, the Navy had 3 operational and 3 experimental flying boats. 2 experimental models were soon dropped, and the third was converted to a transport. Of the operational types, the Catalina had been thoroughly debugged. It was small and slow but reliable and easily serviced. The amphibian Catalina, which was nearing service, added to the design's versatility. The Catalina was the most widely used of all patrol planes. The other 2 flying boats encountered severe problems. Most were used as transports. The Martin design's short engine life indicated that it was overloaded and much gear had to be removed. Eventually, more powerful engines increased effectiveness. By a July 1942 agreement, the Navy obtained multi-engine land planes from the Army Air Force, the North American design, Army Air Force bomber variant, consolidated design, another bomber variant, and Lockheed aircraft. These came to be used more widely than flying boats. Procurement totaled about 4,600 land planes and 4,200 flying boats, including 1,350 for Allies. The land planes were equipped for high-altitude bombing and had to be refitted as patrol planes. This required nearly as many man-hours as it did to build them. Thus, the consolidated design was developed. Twin rudders, the trademark of the Army bomber, were replaced by a single tail, and the body was lengthened. Fuel, guns, and radar were added, and the turbo supercharger was removed. In a similar but less extensive redesign, the first Lockheed version was superseded by the second with greater wingspan and area. 2 twin-engine land planes were developed. The Lockheed design began in February 1943, and the Martin design in July 1944. They used the largest engines available. The latter also had auxiliary jets. On October 1, 1946, a Lockheed aircraft completed a non-stop flight from Perth, Australia, to Columbus, Ohio, showing the soundness of design and concept. Submarine warfare was mostly ignored between the wars. Anti-submarine warfare started from scratch in September 1939 when German submarines attacked British shipping. Aircraft were used for search. Admiral K. Dennitz, in charge of submarines, contemptuously noted that aircraft could no more sink submarines than crows could eliminate moles. This changed in August 1940 when the British began using aerial depth bombs. In November 1940, the director of the Chief of Naval Operations War Plans Division listed American anti-submarine warfare devices and commented, "Although the list of projects is formidable, the list of accomplishments is meager. Of the 19 projects listed, only magnetic detectors and shortwave radar with position indicator were for aircraft. The Atlantic Fleet received 1,000 depth bombs for service tests in mid-1941. General use began in the spring of 1942. During one attack, a depth bomb hit a surfaced submarine and wedged in a grating. When an eager sailor rolled it over the side, the hydrostatic fuse worked, and the depth charge exploded, destroying the submarine. Various aircraft were used: patrol planes, observation aircraft on inshore patrol, fighters and torpedo bombers in escort carrier, based squadrons, and airships. As capabilities were developed, aircraft became effective annihilators as well as hunters. Different devices helped make the aircraft a potent enemy of submarines. Geologists used airborne magnetometers to hunt for oil in the late 1920s. In October 1941, a Catalina at Naval Air Station Quonset Point, Rhode Island, testing similar gear, detected a submarine. A project, established at Quonset Point in June 1942, tested magnetic airborne detectors under development by the Naval Ordnance Laboratory and National Defense Research Council. In December 1942, service use of magnetic airborne detectors began in conjunction with retro rockets which had been tested at Goldstone Lake, California, in July 1942. On March 7, 1942, an airship and submarine tested a radio sonobuoy and found that it could hear a submarine 3 miles away and that its radio transmission was received by airships at a 5-mile range. By December 1943, practical radio sonobuoys had been designed and built and were being assigned to anti-submarine warfare squadrons, beginning with the squadron on Block Island. In 1943, submarines began staying on the surface and fighting back against aircraft. This led to increasing forward firepower and armor in anti-submarine warfare aircraft. For example, the twin smaller caliber forward turret in the Catalina was replaced by a twin larger caliber turret. Forward-firing rockets, introduced in late 1943, proved an effective counter. Another important piece of equipment was the VHF radio, which facilitated airborne communications. Airborne searchlights, coordinated with detectors, helped locate surfaced submarines at night. In 1945, periscopes were installed in the Catalina's radio compartment to help focus the wing-mounted light. Rotary wing aircraft trials in the 1920s and 30s were non-productive. Early in the war, Coast Guard aviators urged the Navy to resume tests. Receiving responsibility in February 1943, the Coast Guard conducted training and experimentation at Floyd Bennett Field, Brooklyn, New York. Bureau of Aeronautics in March 1943 ordered 3 Sikorsky helicopters. In October 1943, it ordered trainers for early delivery. And in 1944 ordered tandem rotor designs and twin-engine helicopters. In May 1943, the Navy watched an Army pilot land a helicopter aboard a tanker in Long Island Sound. In January 1944, a Coast Guard pilot with a helicopter embarked on the British freighter Dagestan. Limited flying was possible on only 3 days during the midwinter Atlantic crossing, and a combined evaluation board concluded that existing machines were not adequate for anti-submarine warfare. On January 3, 1944, a helicopter delivered blood plasma from Lower Manhattan to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, for survivors of an explosion on the destroyer Turner. In May, a Coast Guard pilot with a helicopter rescued 11 Canadian airmen from northern Labrador. A helicopter was also tested as an ambulance. Rescue hoists were developed and tested, and an automatic pilot was developed. In May 1945, dunking sonar was tested. In short, the helicopter's utility as a rescue craft was demonstrated, and as the war ended, it was poised for anti-submarine warfare and other uses. Navy Pioneer guided missile development grew out of a radio-controlled target airplane begun in 1936 and used in 1938. One result was the target drone of the Second World War. The people involved were certain that radio-controlled aircraft would make effective weapons. To that end, a radio altimeter was initiated in 1939 and airborne television and radar guidance in 1941. The Naval Aircraft Factory and Utility Squadron 5 were assigned projects, which involved the development and testing of radio-controlled offensive weapons. After torpedo and crash dive attacks were demonstrated in early 1942, Admiral Ernest J. W. King directed that guided missiles be developed and readied for combat in decisive quantity. Bureau of Aeronautics undertook development of radio-controlled, television-directed attack drones. Bureau of Ordnance, through National Defense Research Council and the Bureau of Standards, developed radar-directed glide bombs. The attack drone involved Naval Aircraft Factory and air stations at Cape May, New Jersey, Traverse City, Michigan, and Clinton, Oklahoma. Naval Aircraft Factory made some drones. Small companies with minimal or no aviation experience made the rest. Even so, success was achieved, and the proponents vainly sought an escort carrier for a combat trial. In September 1944, a drone unit deployed to the Northern Solomons, and in a 30-day trial hit Rabaul and other bypassed enemy positions. The heavy bomber was also used as a guided missile. Rather than risk unmanned liftoff, a pilot would fly off the explosive-laden machine, switch to radio control and bail out. Intended against German targets, the first machine exploded over England soon after takeoff, killing the two-man crew. On September 3, 1944, a radio-controlled bomber hit a barracks at a German submarine base in Heligoland. The radar-directed glide bomb was used by some bomber squadrons in 1945. It sank at least one Japanese merchantman. Bureau of Aeronautics and Bureau of Ordnance initiated a number of missiles in 1944 and 1945, air and surface launches and targets and numerous guidance, propulsion, and airframe systems were used. Of these, one design was a carrier adaptation of an army version of the German flying bomb. Another design was begun in May 1945 as an emergency counter to the kamikaze. It used a jet-assisted takeoff unit for propulsion, carried a 100-pound warhead, and had a 2.5-mile range. Opinions vary as to whether guided missile efforts were too little or too soon. The technology has proven to be much more complex than it appeared, but much sound work was done. Development of engine components increased power and reliability. Fuel quality, also essential, was upgraded as supplies permitted from a performance number, roughly octane number of 100 in 1941 to 115, 145 in 1945. In 1942, Pratt & Whitney developed a water injection system which provided a 20 to 30% increase in maximum power for about 10 minutes. The large engine used in several developmental aircraft, including designs that reached a high degree of development in part because of its earlier use in the Army bomber. In 1940, Pratt & Whitney began an engine with 28 cylinders in 4 rows. Limited production was achieved by 1945, and it was used in racing aircraft and developmental bombers. Jet-powered aircraft were flown in Germany in 1939, Italy, 1940, and England, 1941. From 1938 on, the United States Army and Navy had sponsored rocket and jet propulsion studies. By 1941, European progress was becoming known, and a National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Special Committee on Jet Propulsion was formed. As development began, the Army and Navy recognized that their aircraft production relied on reciprocating engines and chose not to divert major aviation resources to jet propulsion. Thus, both Wright and Pratt & Whitney concentrated on piston engines, while outsiders, General Electric, Westinghouse, and Alice Chalmers, worked on gas turbines. The Army obtained British data, while the Navy sponsored Alice Chalmers' study of ducted fans and Westinghouse's study of axial flow turbojets. On October 22, 1942, Bureau of Aeronautics authorized Westinghouse to build a jet engine. One of these was test-flown in a Goodyear Corsair in January 1944. An improved model powered the twin-engine McDonnell experimental design, which made its first flight in January 1945. In the fall of 1941, I heard rumors of a wondrous device that could fix an airplane's range, course, speed, size, and loading. Other tales were slightly less bizarre. Thus, in 1944, Commander William I. Martin, later a retired vice admiral, recalled his initial shock of finding out that radar did not present a colored picture of the terrain. By modern standards, wartime radar was crude. Sets were soldered with bulky tubes, resistors, capacitors, and so forth. As the Navy, National Defense Research Council Radiation Lab, and radio and electrical industries developed airborne radar, they learned of the need for minimum weight, compactness, and ruggedness in carrier plane equipment. The radar, developed by the Naval Research Laboratory from a radio altimeter, became the search radar. 25 sets were ordered in December 1941 and delivered in October 1942 for experimental service. The search radar underwent constant updating, and the last of the 26,000 sets obtained were the final version. The search radar was used for search and bombing in the Avenger and other carrier planes. A radar operator was necessary, but a pilot's repeat indicator could be installed. Some neutrality patrol planes had British air-to-surface vessel radar. It used large antennas, one for sending and a second for receiving. A Naval Research Laboratory-designed duplexer, enabling a single antenna to do both, was used in Navy airborne radar and in Naval Research Laboratory's modification of the air-to-surface vessel. Microwave or centimetre radar, made possible by the British cavity magnetron, gave sharp definition with a small antenna. A 10-centimetre radar with plane position indicator was tested at Boston Airport in September 1941, and by mid-November, preliminary design of a 3-centimetre radar was made. The 10-centimetre radar was used in airships in later 1942 and also in heavy bombers. The 3-centimetre variants, the latter in a nacelle, were used for search, navigation, and bombing. Another version was used for night interception, and the 3-centimetre replacement model superseded the 10-centimetre version. Airborne early warning was begun in 1942 after Admiral King expressed a need for the Navy to see over the hill, that is, beyond the horizon. This resulted in a 10-centimetre radar in an Avenger, with radar data relayed to a shipboard combat information center. A second version, added in 1945, included radar and an airborne combat information center in an Army bomber patrol plane. The kamikaze increased their urgency, and in 1945, 27 modified Avengers were equipped, and the first land-based airborne early warning squadron was established. Neither saw combat. With ground-controlled approach, air traffic controllers used surface radar to control aircraft landing in extremely poor visibility. After an experimental demonstration in December 1942, it was used for real on New Year's Day 1943 to land Catalinas at Boston Airport after a sudden snowstorm closed Quonset Point. In looking back at Second World War technical development, the most important element was the enormous number of military aircraft built. This was made possible by the American aviation industry's successful conversion from handicraft to mass production. Qualitative superiority was almost equally important. Our carrier planes destroyed some 12,000 enemy aircraft, including 6,500 in air combat, while losing 450 planes in air combat. The quality of American aircraft steadily improved as engineers and scientists expended great effort in improving existing equipment and aircraft designs. Technical areas of special importance were radar, airborne and surface, and the overlapping field of anti-submarine warfare, where we began from scratch. Improved designs with which the fleet was outfitted in 1942 through 1943, most notably the Avenger, Corsair, Hellcat, and Helldiver, in large measure provided the wings of victory. Other aircraft, including some whose development was begun after we entered the war, were being readied for combat at the end with promise of further improvement. Effort in advanced areas involving jet propulsion and missiles proceeded more deliberately so as not to interfere with production of more conventional models. By contrast, and as confirmed by post-war investigation, Germany was superior in jet propulsion, high-speed aerodynamics, bombardment missiles, and submarines. German interchange with the Japanese was much less complete than that between the United States and Britain. Japan did, however, use a small rocket-propelled suicide plane. Except for accidents of timing, advanced German technology might have changed the course of the war. On the other hand, the German effort might have been more effectively applied to producing conventional weapons. As it turned out, the combination of decisions made, hard work, superior resources, and good luck favored our side. The naval aviation establishment which ended the Second World War was a far cry from the one which entered it. Seagoing aviation had to expand manifold to meet the innumerable needs of round-the-world total maritime war. The organization that proved itself suited to the needs of the pre-war service was quickly outgrown, and the war years brought a continuous process of change and adjustment. Through the 20s and 30s, the pre-war Navy was organized on a task basis. Where we now have Atlantic and Pacific fleets, we then had what was called the United States Fleet, roughly analogous to Japan's combined fleet. Based on the tactical concepts of the day, the United States Fleet was divided into a Pacific-based battle force and a scouting force, stationed in the Atlantic until 1932, and then shifted to join the battle force in the Pacific. Battleships, destroyers, and some cruisers formed the battle force. The scouting force consisted primarily of cruisers, one of whose primary roles was fleet reconnaissance. During this period, the makeup and use of these forces varied with the time. Aircraft carriers were assigned to the battle force. though Lexington served with the scouting force for a short while in the early 1930s. In 1938, as world tensions grew at the time of the Munich Conference, an Atlantic Squadron was created. In the fall of 1940, this became the Patrol Force, reflecting its most important task, the Neutrality Patrol, established by President Roosevelt to keep hostile forces out of the Western Hemisphere. In February 1941, the Patrol Force became the Atlantic Fleet. At the same time, the United States Fleet was rechristened the Pacific Fleet. During 1940 through 1941, the carriers, long concentrated in the Pacific with the battle force, were divided between Atlantic and Pacific. A typical carrier air group, as it was called, of the 1930s included a fighting, bombing, scouting, and torpedo squadron, nominally 72 combat planes in all. As always, there were the usual exceptions. Wasp, smaller than her contemporaries, got 2 fighting and 2 scouting squadrons. Not until early 1942 did she get a torpedo squadron to replace one of her fighting squadrons. Through the pre-war years, in training evolutions and in the annual fleet problems, large-scale strategic and tactical war games played over thousands of square miles of ocean for a month or more, carrier aviation practiced airstrikes as well as fleet scouting and air defense. American doctrine placed responsibility for fleet reconnaissance on the carrier scouting squadrons. Radar did not even begin to join the fleet until 1941, and satellites were decades in the future. Surface and aerial scouting still depended on visual observation. Into the early campaigns of the Second World War, the principal task of scouting units was visual reconnaissance. Scouting squadrons, like their bombing counterparts, flew dive bombers. Once action began, scouting and bombing squadrons joined in strike missions. This gave a typical pre-war or early wartime carrier an air group with 3 attack aircraft to each fighter. When we entered the Second World War, a typical carrier air wing still consisted of fighting, scouting, bombing, and torpedo squadrons. Air wings and their squadrons were neatly numbered to correspond to their carrier. Thus, Yorktown had Air Group 5, consisting of the 5th Fighting Squadron, 5th Bombing Squadron, and so on. This rather quickly broke down as air units were assigned and rotated, and also, apparently, for security reasons. Air groups evolved as the war progressed in a continuing process of adaptation to changing targets and circumstances. Choices had to be made among aircraft and weapons. This was not a search for the elusive ideal, but simply a determined effort to see that, if not the optimum, at least a satisfactory combination would be placed over the right target at the right time. Opportunities for attacks on major Japanese ships became increasingly rare, and operations against land targets took up more of the strike function. On the other hand, the threat of air attack, always present, took on a new dimension during the final year of war as kamikazes became a major menace to the fleet. Scouting squadrons disappeared as surface and airborne radar took over the search and detection mission. By the Gilbert's operation, late in 1943, a typical air group included 36 plane fighting and bombing squadrons and an 18-plane torpedo squadron. To meet the urgent early war need for carriers, 9 light cruisers were completed as small carriers. Though considerably smaller than their fleet carrier contemporaries, they were true, fast carriers and operated with the carrier striking force during the Pacific offensives of 1943 through 1945. The carrier striking force was organized into task groups, each made up of several flatops with their screen of gunships. During the Gilbert's operation, 3 task groups each included 2 fleet carriers and a light carrier. A reserve task group had the old Saratoga and a light carrier. By 1945, a task group could have as many as 3 fleet carriers and a pair of light carriers. An early light carrier air group included 2 smaller fighter squadrons and a composite squadron of Avengers. By 1945, it typically had 1 fighting squadron and a small torpedo squadron. One problem that received much attention was the organization of the carrier force itself. Through 1942, carrier task organization was discussed at length. Should carriers operate singly or in company? As so often happens, battle experience elicited conflicting interpretations. At Coral Sea, for instance, Lexington and Yorktown operated together at first to coordinate their air operations and anti-aircraft defense. When Japanese air attack began, however, the ships with their screens separated. At Midway, the three American carriers operated as two task forces. Admiral Ernest King felt that carriers should operate individually, each with its own screen. Some argued, with the Japanese experience at Midway in mind, that multi-carrier forces presented vulnerable targets. Visual contact was sometimes difficult to maintain, and collisions were a threat at night or while radically maneuvering under attack. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, on the other hand, thought that the aggregate offensive and defensive capabilities of carriers operating together outweighed those of ships working singly. By 1943, radar, introduced as the United States entered the war, had been disseminated throughout the fleet. This had a critical impact on fleet operations. Ships could now maneuver in numbers, even at night or in foul weather. As radar had helped the Royal Air Force to turn the tide during the Battle of Britain, so it now gave a vital edge to fleet air defense. Approaching hostiles could be detected at long ranges, and defending fighters could be effectively directed. Fire control radar and the proximity fuse increased the deadliness of screening ships' anti-aircraft fire. All this helped to make multi-carrier task organization possible. As constituted during the Pacific offensives from the Gilberts to the shores of Japan, the carrier task force was able to combine firepower, mobility, and defensive capability to a degree that even the world's first cruise missile offensive, massed kamikaze attacks off Okinawa, could not defeat. Escort aircraft carriers built on freighter hulls began to appear as the war went on. Long Island was commissioned in 1941. A few more followed in 1942. By 1943, they were joining the fleet in numbers. The small carriers could not handle a conventional air group, nor had they any reason to. Their mission was anti-submarine warfare, and in the Pacific, close air support of amphibious landings. Where a fleet carrier might operate 90 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers, an escort carrier would have a composite squadron made up of fighters and torpedo bombers. Though the small carriers did have torpedoes in their magazines, just in case, the torpedo bombers were included in the composite squadrons primarily for their ability to carry loads of bombs and rockets for use against submarines or shore targets. 4 larger escort carriers, converted from fleet oilers, were bigger than the others of their type. They were the only escort carriers to have miniature air groups, made up of a small fighting squadron and a composite squadron of Avengers and dive bombers. Wartime experience showed that air superiority over target areas was essential for successful strikes. This led to changes in the aircraft mix in carrier air groups, giving fighter aircraft more emphasis. Newer fighters, the Hellcat and Corsair, unlike earlier fighters, could carry 500 or 1,000-pound bombs and the new air-to-ground rockets, so this did not meaningfully degrade the carrier's attack capability. Fighters were used as fighter bombers to hit surface targets, and their new role was recognized by creation of bomber fighter squadrons. During 1945, the suicide plane became the principal threat to the fleet, and the Fighter Combat Air Patrol was recognized as the fleet's essential first line of defense. Gunfire spotting had long been a primary mission of battleship and cruiser float plane units. American catapult planes did not have the power and speed of their German and Japanese contemporaries, and planners worried about their chances to survive and perform their mission in situations where heavy opposition was expected. During the Normandy landings, Navy spotter pilots flew Spitfire fighters borrowed from the British. The expedient worked well. The pilots liked the fighter's performance and ability to defend itself. By 1944, an observation fighting squadron was ready for service. The pilots went through fighter training, then learned spotting from the Army at Fort Sill, Lawton, Oklahoma, before going to Casco Bay, Maine, for final training with naval gunfire ships. They saw their first combat in southern France, flying Hellcats from the escort carrier Tulagi. Word of their capabilities got to the Pacific Fleet's amphibious commander, Admiral Turner, who asked for the new squadron's services in the offensives planned for 1945. Hellcats were now replaced by a mix of improved Wildcats and Avengers. The unit was rechristened a Composite Observation Squadron and supported the landings at Lingayen Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Airborne radar was introduced early in the Second World War. The first radars were surface search sets used by land-based patrol bombers to hunt submarines. From the early Pacific campaigns, the Japanese had made good use of land-based planes for night attacks on our naval forces. Carrier-based Avengers later got radar and used it to guide fighters to make night intercepts. Before the war ended, improved radars were fitted to fighters, and night fighter squadrons went to sea in the carriers Independence and Enterprise. Then, as now, patrol squadrons formed a major part of the naval air establishment. Through the interwar years, patrol aviation meant flying boats, large multi-engine seaplanes for long-range search and bombing missions from coastal bases. In 1935, patrol wings appeared, but these were not so much air commands as simply a means of referring to two or more patrol squadrons operating in the same general area. 2 years later, patrol wings were numbered and given their own command and organizational standing. By 1939, a typical patrol wing had 2 to 5 squadrons of flying boats, with its own wing utility unit of planes. Like destroyer flotillas and submarine squadrons of their time, the wings also had command of assigned seaplane tenders. Patrol wings were first thought of as a form of coast defense, searching out and reporting threats to American territory. Others felt that the seaplane could play a combat role and that patrol planes should be used in conjunction with the fleet. During 1937, the patrol wings were assigned to the fleet's scouting force and became, at least theoretically, a mobile force to work with the forces afloat, though, in practice, they continued much as before. In 1940, the Atlantic-based patrol wings were assigned to the new patrol force. When the Atlantic and Pacific fleets were created in 1941, Atlantic Patrol Aviation became Patrol Wings, Atlantic Fleet. Its Pacific counterpart remained part of what was now the Scouting Force, Pacific Fleet, until 1942 when it became Patrol Wings Pacific. Wartime development of patrol aviation focused on developing an organization that would allow a vastly increased force to operate, virtually worldwide, as effectively as possible on its own or with other forces. Experience in the North Atlantic, even before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, showed that patrol planes could be operated most efficiently as consolidated commands. This led to a reorganization in mid-1942, where squadrons had previously been permanently assigned to wings, and wings had been thought of as potentially mobile formations. The wings now became stationary commands assigned to specific areas. The squadrons were assigned and reassigned to wings as the situation demanded. Each wing had a headquarters squadron, which pooled ground personnel and handled most of the administrative and support tasks for the operating squadrons. Each headquarters squadron had detachments, called Patrol Aircraft Service Units, to support squadrons at outlying bases. Similar outfits, called Carrier Aircraft Service Units and Scout Observation Service Units, provided services ashore to carrier squadrons and floatplane units from battleships or cruisers. The Second World War introduced land planes to the patrol establishment. Since land and seaplanes shared the same basic missions, they shared the same organization. Sea Frontiers, the naval commands set up to defend our coastal areas, operated inshore patrol squadrons, and variously designated. As airships came into service for anti-submarine patrol duty, they were organized into specialized squadrons. In the fall of 1942, these coastal patrol units came under the administrative control of the patrol wings, though the Sea Frontiers retained operational command. On November 1, 1942, patrol wings were redesignated Fleet Air Wings, to be made up of all aircraft needed to perform land-based aviation missions in their respective areas. As in the surface forces, air groups, aviation task groups, were formed to carry out specific operations. On September 1, 1942, Naval Air Forces, Pacific Fleet, had been established to serve as a policy and advisory command. At the beginning of 1943, a similar command was created in the Atlantic. These acted as type commanders for all fleet air activities, ship and shore-based, to bring them into closer coordination and develop their overall potential. Commander Air Force, Atlantic Fleet and Naval Air Forces, Pacific Fleet continued to provide support and coordination to air forces operating from England and North Africa to the Southwest Pacific through Victory Day. When the war ended in Europe, 8 Fleet Air Wings were operating in the Atlantic area, with 9 in the Pacific. Between them, they commanded 91 patrol squadrons. Atlantic strength dropped quickly. In the Pacific, though the pace of war remained intense, Air wing strength remained constant, and squadron strength even went down slightly as the theatre of war contracted around the Japanese home islands. By Victory Day, just over one-third of the Navy's patrol squadrons were flying seaplanes. The rest were equipped with land planes, a trend that would continue through the post-war years, although some flying boats were still in the fleet as late as the Vietnam era. Wartime aviation experience, and hence organization, did not follow the original expectations of pre-war thinkers. Geography, technology, and military situations often dictated new and untried courses. Many of the details of wartime command structures may not serve the precise needs of the future, but the attitudes behind them, flexibility, openness to new concepts, and readiness to adapt to changing circumstances, served the Navy well from the Neutrality Patrol to Tokyo Bay. They will be just as essential in the years to come.